to tonight's lecture, George Orwell, 1984 and Beyond, presented by Joan Baum. We hope you enjoy this evening's lecture and the folks at home that are zooming in. If you're in the virtual audience and you have any questions, when we get to the Q&A part, you're very welcome to type your questions in the chat and I will read them. And if anyone in-house in our audience today has any questions, feel free just to raise hand and we'll acknowledge the question and we'll find out a lot about this historical piece that has lots of connections. So without further ado, I'll turn over this evening's talk to Joan Baum.
Thank you, Steve. And thank all of you here and zooming in. I'm often asked when I give a talk, what spurred the talk? What was the idea behind it? What was the prompt? And in this case, I'd like to tell you why, with no surprise, I guess. Earlier in the year, I simply got fed up hearing the word. Recently, for example, Josh Hawley, Republican senator from Missouri, Simon & Schuster withdrew his book contract, and Josh Hawley said, "Not be more Orwellian." Lauren Boebert in the news this week for some anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic remarks said earlier in the year, the only thing Orwell got wrong was the year. And after the January 6th riots, my favorite, Donald Trump Jr. Are we living Orwell's 1984? Free speech no longer exists in America. It died with big tech, and what's left is only there for a chosen few. It's Orwellian. The misuse of the term Orwellian, I began to feel, was an insult. And both radicals on the left and right use the term, and in general mean by it political repression or absurdism as they see it. I was also curious about when the term Orwellian first appeared in print. No help here. It was Mary McCarthy, who in an essay in her collection On the Contrary, the first print reference, said when she was describing a fashion magazine that had no point of view besides itself and proclamation itself, said, "A leap into the Orwellian future," meaning stupidity and absurdism. Norman Mailer in 1959 got closer. Virtually perfect Orwellian ambivalences, he said, of war is peace, love is hate, ignorance is knowledge, which are the watchwords in 19. Later, The Guardian, closer. The debate about reforms by the BBC's Director General was reopened yesterday. Devastating criticism accusing an Orwellian regime in sycophancy. And that's pretty much how the term tends to be used. But in 2002, Christopher Hitchens, in a wonderful book, and he's a wonderful critic, got it right. And the name of his book, by the way, is Why Orwell Matters. And if you don't know about this critic, I suggest you should. He's a bad boy, witty, sharp, brilliant. And he said, Orwellian is a state of affairs of crushing tyranny, fear, and conformism due to language-aided manipulation. That's the part that gets left out. The dictionaries moved quickly. The OED, by 2019 in its online edition, described Orwellian as characteristic or suggestive, particularly of the totalitarian state depicted in the dystopia 1984, where it is used to refer to the degradation of language. And that is the essential connection that all the general references don't have. And so I wanted to say something in defense of Orwell, and particularly now about the link between tyranny and the abuse of language. And just coincidentally, but really not, Orwell suddenly seemed very much in the news. I want to call attention to a book, and I'm going to hold it up. I usually do not like graphic novels, but I saw a reference to George Orwell, the graphic novel. And I said, well, let's just take a look. And I wasn't prepared to like it and admire it a great deal, particularly when I heard that the artist was a Brazilian. And I thought, with Bolsonaro afoot, no wonder he's doing 1984, the graphic novel. It is very well done. He has just taken Orwell. He has not amended or changed anything. And he has the distinction of being the only publication of 1984, aside from the real one, that includes what happens at the very end of adaptations and movies don't have. And I'll mention that later. So it's not just we have a graphic novel just coming out. By the way, the artist's name is Fido Nesti. And I was so impressed that he and I have become, I hope, and continuing, email pals. And he's worked on other novels. There also is a TV series in the works, I have read. And as of January 2021, it was being advertised. It's supposed to be a 5-part limited series. The producers say the adaptation will be a bold new version for modern times and a world that is now grappling with and addicted to misinformation and false realities. And they particularly want to do it for the TV screen. They think that it's a natural home in a society where people trust their screens more than the real world. But interestingly enough, this adaptation, and I have no update information about it, is not based on Orwell's novel, but on a stage play that was created and directed by Rick Ickey and Duncan Macmillan, whom I don't know, but would like to, who wrote a play that first ran in the West End in London, and then, and I don't know how I missed it, ran at the Hudson Theater in New York in 2017 for 4 months. I have no recollection of reading about it. And this is what the TV series is going to reference in its adaptation. The play, and I hadn't seen it, but I did read about it and really about the reception. Obviously, the play generated so much excitement that security guards had to be placed inside the theater. No one under the age of 13 was admitted. The play contained extreme torture scenes, strobe lights, sudden blackouts, jackhammer sounds. Some people were reported to have fainted, including the actress Jennifer Lawrence, who threw up. And at the end, the audience was screaming at one another. I would say if this ran for 4 months, God bless. And it will really be interesting to see what happens if this does become an adaptation on TV. So who was George Orwell? Oh, by the way, I did want to mention when I stopped in at book Hampton the other day, there's Orwell all over the place again, and not just Animal Farm in 1980. So who was he? He wasn't George Orwell. He was Eric Arthur Blair, dates 1903 to 1950. He was born in Bengal, India. His father was a minor British customs official in the Indian Civil Service and was a policeman in Burma. George Orwell, still known as Blair at the time, became a policeman. Hated the work. He saw the brutality and he had insight into the colonial mentality and class differences. And pictures of him at the time always show him with that thin little mustache, which all British officers stationed in Burma had in those days. Just an aside, those are the only pictures I've seen for. And when I came across one that was different, I brought it in just because it was different. Here is George Orwell in 1939 with his goat Muriel. Thought that was very sweet. He was a remarkable man, not just a remarkable writer. He lived most of his life in poverty and isolation. He lived first in the East End in London and then in Paris. And those of you who know his book, Down and Out in London and Paris, know that it reflects his observations, which are incredible, and anyone seeking to be a reporter should read them. He also wrote about the coal mines, working poor in northern England and the class divisions, the road to Wigan Pier, 1937. Eventually, he came back and was teaching and writing in England, and he needed a cover to his name to protect his family. Known at the time as being very far on the left until he became an ardent anti-communist. And he was concerned that his family in this very divisive atmosphere would be harmed. And so he decided on the name George Orwell. From what I read, he picked George because it was extremely common, the king's name, and the Orwell is a river in Ipswich. He became an anarchist, then a radical socialist, then a critic of both. And the turning point for him politically was the Spanish Civil War, where he was severely wounded. His experience there is in Homage to Catalonia, which is fantastic work. Again, if people who are interested in journalism don't read Orwell, they're missing, I think, just about the best instruction they could ever get. The army rejected him physically when World War II came, but he served for a period in the Home Guard, where he met an older superior by the name of Frederick Warburg, who would become his publisher. And some of you may know of the firm, it no longer is active, Secker and Warburg. Warburg was the head of the firm from 1936 to 1971, and he wrote a memoir about his time as the publisher and his friendship with George Orwell, wonderfully titled, All Authors Are Equal, with a wonderful allusion to Animal Farm. I recommend this book. It's not that readily available, but it is a fascinating account of publishing in the post-war years. And I learned a great deal. I had been totally unaware of how difficult it was to publish books because of the paper shortage. It wasn't over because it was 1945. And he did what he could. In fact, he said, had he more money, he would have had more paper. Had he had more paper, he really wanted to publish Fitzgerald and Mailer. He did publish Thomas Mann, André Gide, Kafka. The Orwells, George and his wife Eileen, in London from about May 1940, he began to write for Partisan Review, writing a column called London Letters, He also joined the BBC as a producer in the Indian section, and he remained in that position until 1943, when he began the famous novels. Wrote for newspapers. So much of it, perhaps all of it, was autobiographical of his incredible experiences in India, in parts of London that people didn't, in Paris. And he was, as you will see, a fabulous reader. His favorites, no surprise, Shakespeare, Swift, Fielding, Dickens, Flaubert, Joyce, Eliot, Lawrence, Somerset Maugham, Jack London, Arthur Koestler, Emerson, Melville, Miller, Twain, Conrad, Green, and the list probably goes on and on, but those were the ones whose references or allusions pick up. He and his wife had no children of their own, but they adopted a son, Richard. His wife died eventually from illness. He had a second wife, Sonia. Incredible, but he married her on his deathbed to make things right. And he died living on an island in a farmhouse, Inner Hebrides off Scotland. The house was called Barn Hill. And Warburg, who had become his dear, dear friend and devoted assistant at this point, said, "I will pay to have you go to New York for treatment for tuberculosis." And he refused. And he died. He was 47 years old. Gravestone does not say George Orwell there. Although he wrote so much, the two books that most people know, collections, are Animal Farm and 1984. And in Animal Farm, you see the start of the theme that really is at the heart of 1980. Tyranny, degradation of language together, cause and effect and cause and effect. Animal Farm is a novella. It came out in 1945 in August, 11 days after the atomic bomb. It was written in 1943 to 4, when the UK was still in alliance with the USSR. And lots of people were nervous about anything that would seem to be critical of the USSR. And so just about everybody, including T.S. Eliot, turned it down, though Eliot said it had great promise. When it was published in England, it was given a subtitle, perhaps nervousness came through, called A Fairy Story. As you know, it's a fable with animals. And Orwell suggested a different subtitle, Ursa, which means bear, but he said, oh, it's for the Union des Républiques Socialistes Animales. He called it a fable, which it is, which uses animals for political and artistic purposes. And basically the pigs are in charge. Napoleon is Stalin, Marx or Lenin is Old Major, and Snowball is Trotsky. And it turns on events from the Russian Revolution in 1917 to the end of the Stalinist era, which was 1953. It does, as I say, show the start of the great interest in language and tyranny. The good animals in Animal Farm speak correctly. As Orwell said, the ideal is to have language like a pane of glass. The bad animals twist the language, abuse it, lie. Animal Farm, as I said, had trouble getting published. The press was very nervous in England, and although Russia was at this point gobbling up Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and London still had evidence of war, Warburg was the only one to touch it. He said of it, it is not a prophecy. It is a warning. Don't let this happen here. 3 years later, that theme of language, the degradation of language and tyranny comes full head in 1984. Warburg read it and said, "This is among the most terrifying books I have ever read. The savagery of Swift has passed to a successor who looks upon life and finds it becoming ever more intolerable. Orwell has no hope or allows only a flickering. It is a study in pessimism unrelieved." Said a moment ago that Fido Nesti, who did the graphic novel, was the only one to honor the way 1984 ended. The movies, which most people know, did not include this fact. Here is Winston Smith at the end. He's now totally converted to Big Brother-ism. He was in a public dock. He's having this wonderful vision, confessing everything, implicating everybody. He was walking down the white tiled corridor with the feeling of walking in sunlight and an armed guard at his back. A long hoped for bullet was entering his brain. Think about that. Now, do you have any comments about why the movies did not have the bullet entering his brain at the end? I'd be interested in hearing why, do you think? Both movies, and I'll mention them in a second, show Winston happy at last because he's come. The working title of 1984 always surprised people. It was, in 1948, The Last Man in Europe. We don't know how 1984, the numerals, became the title. At one point, Orwell was playing with the language itself, spelling out the words 1984. Some said he wanted to call it, when it was written, 1948. Nice little reversal there. I don't know what the answer is. Perhaps you might speculate. A brief summary of what's going on. The novel is set in an imaginary future. The world is dominated by totalitarian police states, and the protagonist is an Englishman by the name of Winston Smith, a minor functionary in one of those totalitarian states, Oceania. He's 39, he says. He has a wife he can't get rid of, varicose veins, 5 false teeth. Why Winston Smith? Lots of ink spilled about that. I don't know. Winston, the only Winston anybody would readily know would be Winston Churchill. And the only thing of Smith I can think of is that it's a very common name, Everyman. But he's not just Everyman. He's a man who's decent at the very beginning when you first meet him. He works for the Ministry of Truth. Newspeak is the official language. 3 slogans rule the ministry. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Original thought no longer exists. Old ways no longer exists. They're called crime think. His longing for truth and decency leads him to secretly rebel against this government, and he thinks he is. By the way, I forgot to say that passion to connect language, the degradation of language, with Orwell's love of truth and integrity and sincerity. He is the most inventive man in 1984 with all these newspeak languages and all the subdivisions. Very clever, very imaginative. Anyway, and he also invented, I discovered, the term Cold War. And he did that in 1945, which tells you something about historians who were in on things before the later days of the 40s and the 50s. Anyway, good Winston somehow thinks that he can make a difference if he keeps a diary and records what he still, through vague memory, remembers of the old days when things were not so horrible. And so he does. And he thinks that a person who is the supervisor in the ministry is on to him keeping a diary, but is with him and encouraging. And Winston thinks it's true. I have an ally there. And the man's name is O'Brien. Winston also senses that there are other parts of the state he's not allowed to visit, but sneaks out and somehow does. Places where prostitutes and criminals and lower class people live, called proles. They know the truth. They keep their memories. They're worthless to the state, so no one bothers with them. And so we are engaged in a novel where romantically, sentimentally, we hope that the protagonist is going to make a difference. This may be the only novel I can think of that goes downhill swiftly, inevitably, inexorably. There is no escape, which leads Winston to reinterpret, or interpret, I should say, O'Brien's, the fellow he thinks is with him, a sentiment when O'Brien says to him, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." Winston thinks, oh, that's good, light, enlightenment. What irony. He also befriends and is slightly befriended by a bookstore operator, a Mr. Carrington. Shows him a book called Emmanuel Goldstein's The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, which is really an incredible, tough part to read of 1984, but in a way is the heart of the book, the way all those chapters, the philosophical chapters on the whale in Moby Dick are. Not the adventure part, but the philosophical helm of the book. And at the center of this theory and practice book by a now disgraced tyrant who is no longer a tyrant, in fact, he's no longer at all, the discussion is how print made it easier to manipulate public opinion, especially film and radio, carrying the process even further into TV. And you can complete that extension with social media. Winston and the woman he's having an affair with, and it's affair just sex, no love allowed, are both arrested eventually by the thought police. No spoiler here, because that's not what the book is about. And about the rest of the book, I figured maybe a third, even close to a half, is some of the most difficult prose I've ever read. I had to stop reading. It is detailed scenes of torture. And they are graphic, and obviously the theatrical company that put on the adaptation in New York realized the, I would say, the advances of putting on torture scenes for their sales. But in the book, this is at the heart of what is going on. But with this difference, it's not enough to have Winston tortured, because O'Brien says, "You may confess, but in order to root out your mental state and spiritual dignity, you must love the people who torture you." That goes into the final scenes of the book where people are just shouting in glee for Big Brother. And Winston is told he must surrender to monstrous brainwashing techniques. And as I said, this is half the novel, and I'd read it in stages. O'Brien to Winston again. You must humble yourself before you can become sane. Erase all reformist tendencies. And this key line separates this book from all others where people are tortured and then confess whether the truth or not. We do not destroy the heretic because he resists us. So long as he resists us, we never destroy him. Hurt him. We capture his inner mind. We reshape him. We burn all evil and illusion out of him. Mind and inner heart must be remade, and it's done with language. There have been many adaptations of 1984. Movies, TV dramas, opera, theater. Steve told me about an upcoming musical. I can't imagine that. And the planned TV series that I mentioned before. But many of you may have seen the movie that I did many, many years ago. And it was with Edmund O'Brien as Winston Smith, Anne Sterling as Julia, good-looking lady, she's not so in the book, and Michael Redgrave as O'Brien, except his name isn't O'Brien in this movie because Edmund O'Brien is the star. So he's changed to O'Connor. And this movie came out in 1956 in the wake of McCarthyism. It's in black and white, and it starts with big blockbuster letters. This is a story of the future. That's debatable. And the opening shot is of the A-bomb. A lot more sex than in the book, more nudity. People here are called brothers and sisters, not comrades. But it doesn't really do it. You can probably, some of you have seen that movie. What surprises me is the number of people, including who did not see the movie that was made after that. 1984 was the date it was released. And it stars John Hurt as Winston Smith, Cyril Cusack as the book dealer Carrington, the pawn shop proprietor, and I think one of the most spectacular performances I have ever seen of Richard Burton as O'Brien. It is brilliantly icy, incredible, and he died later that year. So this is the last role that Burton ever performed. Get that movie. It is terrific. But as I said, neither movie mentions what Vito Nesti's graphic novel does and what Orwell clearly does with the bullet coming. It's not enough that he is just reduced to what he is intended to be, but he's going to get the bullet now. It's totally cynical. I hope you read the book, but I also hope you read essays of many essays. He's a brilliant, brilliant writer. In fact, I think next to Hazlitt, I would say he was my two top favorites. He wrote two essays that particularly I think will interest you. And both the same year in 1946, right before he wrote. Or the first one, and they're short, Why I Write. He says there are four great motives for writing prose, and the order is wonderful. 1, sheer egoism, vanity. Say it, it's true. 2, a love of language, a love of sound, a sense of the beauty of language. 3, historical impulse, a desire to see things as they are, the truth. It reminded me of Norman Mailer's this quip that if you want facts, do nonfiction. If you want truth, do fiction, do a novel. And the fourth, he wanted to exercise his political point of view. He wanted to make writing about politics and art to expose lies. Angry, right. Writers are driven by inner demons. The second essay, same year, is the one I mentioned in a little promo for the talk. It's wonderful. Politics and the English language. If I had my way, this essay would be required reading at least in every college freshman English course, if not in high school, if people are still reading. And Orwell says, most people would admit the English language is in a bad way and assume we can't do anything about it. Our language becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish. But the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. And so it goes. One infects the other. And that is what 1984 demonstrates and argues. I won't go into the substance of that essay, but again, anyone who is a writer here should have that essay and the illustrations of the degradation due to what in language printed, over the bed, the staleness of imagery, the lack of precision, the mixture of vagueness and sheer incompetence, especially in political writing. Worn out metaphors, similes, idioms, incompatible metaphors, bloated phrases, pretentious diction, noun constructions out of verbs, overuse of foreign words and expression, jargon, meaningless words in literature and art criticism particularly, pseudoscientific terms, words in place of short words, too many words. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. When the atmosphere is bad, language suffers. And he says this is true from the right to the left, conservatives and anarchists. They all want to make lies sound truthful, murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. I opened my talk with a reference to Christopher Hitchens, who wrote this wonderful book, Why Orwell Matters. I want to conclude with that. Orwell matters because he had integrity, honesty, never pandered at any time, especially 1939, when most of the intellectual class and the church compromised. Never abandoned the subjects he took on, imperialism, fascism, Stalinism. He was uncommonly independent and prescient about all those isms and dangers they do to language, psychobabble, bureaucratic speech that kills truth and clear thinking. There's an Orwell Foundation, the home of the Orwell Prize and Youth Prize essays, which I like. Can't do anything about our current generation, but maybe the new ones, maybe. And they're dedicated, as their mission is, to celebrating the honest writing and reporting and uncovering hidden lives and confronting uncomfortable truths by way of the clarity of language. I want to say, and advocating obviously, that I have taken the pledge, as difficult as it is in writing and as far as I can in talks, I will not use terms like woke, political correctness, fascism, sexism, racism, words particularly ending in ISM and I. because of the Orwellian argument against them. Challenge someone, get to specifics. This is perhaps the only positive tone that can be on 1984, which, as I said, Frederick Warburg found the most depressing, pessimistic book without even a scintilla of hope. And yet, just as I was getting prepared for this talk, I open up the New Yorker and see a review, a book I never heard of, but it sure caught my eye, called Orwell's Roses, written by a writer who went to see where George Orwell lived and had a garden, terribly moved that there were still roses. Someone was tending them. He wanted to write about that. The hope that even a political writer, passion for nature, if he had no passion or hope for human nature, there was still some, as with Muriel the goat, for animals and for the nature all around him. He loved gardening. Like Voltaire, is that what we're being urged to do? Cultivate our own gardens. Says at the end, Orwell did not believe in permanent happiness or the politics that tried to realize it, but he did believe devoutly in moments of delight and rapture. So I certainly urge you to read or reread 1984. And I highly recommend the Burton film that came out in 1980. Terrific, but hold the popcorn. Thank you. I'd be very happy to take questions. Probably I have no answers, but it would be good to hear from you anyway. So let's not put it as a Q&A, but comments. I'm just curious, is there anyone here who saw that 1984 movie with Burton? I don't know what happened to it. And I think you have it here, Steve, at the library.
We have it on DVD, and it's also available for streaming on Canopy. We have the Canopy service.
Right, indeed. I forgot about that, right. And don't watch it alone. It is really tough with the torture scenes. But as I said, the book is even more horrendous. I have no recollection of having read those scenes before, but they are very hard. I hope I haven't ended on a downer, because the one thing that I would like to say, and it's obvious, but of all the pessimism, of all the despair, starting with Warburg's observations and my own comments, the one thing that stands out, he wrote the book, took the energy to create this novel, use the anger and move it out. And the great irony is so many people think they know the book, misuse the term Orwellian. And yet the irony, after those three people who abused the term with which I began, the irony was, as the New York Times pointed out, 1984 shot up on the bestseller lists again. It's never far from being in the top 100. And that's amazing, because I now strongly suspect that there are many people who haven't read it or read just sections of it. Because I think if you reread it now, you will indeed remember. And if there is that TV series that will run, watch out for the strobe lights and the jackhammers, although the theater experience cannot be reimagined on TV.
We have from our audience at home, we have a comment. So good to hear your thoughts and research on Orwell. Totally agree about his purity and mastery of clarity. Does anyone from our virtual audience have any questions? You're welcome to type the questions in the chat if you'd like, as well as anyone in our in-house audience. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to raise your hand and ask your question.
As I said before, just to fill in, I read many, many books, and many of them move me deeply. This one influenced me. One made me change my ways. I really have taken the pledge. I don't know how I'm going to get by in a company where ism words are very quick to be thrown around, but I'm never going to use those words in print if I can help it. Dig deeper. We'll see. I have a talk coming up that I've scheduled for a couple of months on a book that was written in 1905 and by Thomas Dixon Jr. called The Klansman. And it was the basis of perhaps the most significant movie, influential movie ever made, The Birth of a Nation. And before Orwell, B.O., I would have said so racist. But now I'll have to make sure I know what I'm talking about if I want to make that accusation, because those words don't appear in the novel. And it was literally the book that influenced The Birth of a Nation so much so that the original title was called The Klansman. It's a historical romance, and I wanted to see what undergirded many of these ism words. There it is. But as I said, I don't know how I'll get by, but it's a good challenge. And I think it's rare. You'll have to think for yourself of other books that have not only, oh, this is great, reread it, but have changed the way you behave, whether it's writing or acting, whatever. So for that reason alone, I think he was a remarkable human being, well, as a remarkable writer. Were this decades ago, I'd be over there watering his roses too. So thank you again.